Hi everyone, good day. I am Maria Calambao and today we are going to discuss about Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning. But before that, let me introduce my co-reporters for this topic, which are Cindy Misa and Michelle Masson. Without further ado, let us begin. Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who first discovered the classical conditioning. He was born on September 26, 1849 in Russian Empire. He died on February 27, 1936 at the age of 86. He uncovers the classical conditioning theory, which is defined as a learning process governed by associations between an environmental stimulus and another stimulus which occurs naturally. Classical conditioning, quite simply, is learning by association. It is when a person or animal associates one stimulus with something that was not previously associated. For example, if you run an electric can opener in front of a dog who had never eaten anything out of a can before, he may not respond to the sound in any way. But if you begin feeding the same dog canned food, he'll soon learn to associate the sound of the electric opener with the advent of his dinner and begin to display great excitement whenever the electric can opener runs. For more information, let me give the screen to Cindy Misa. Cindy, take it away.
So good afternoon everyone, good afternoon ma'am. So today we will be tackling about the three phases of classical conditioning. So how classical conditioning works? Classical conditioning involves forming an association between two stimuli resulting in a learned response. So there are three basic phases of this process. So first is before conditioning or the preconditioning. First part of the classical conditioning is before conditioning, which process that requires a naturally occurring stimulus that will automatically elicit a response. Salivating in response to the smell of food is a good example of naturally occurring stimulus. So this phase is the good example is kanang simhot o kanang sudan inana. So during this phase of the process, the unconditioned stimulus or UCS results in an unconditioned response. So if we present a food that it is naturally and automatic triggers a salivation response. So dali ra natural o dali ra sad siya automatic sa magkuan o ka response. So in the before conditioning and the preconditioning, an unconditioned stimulus is paired with an unconditioned response. So a neutral stimulus is then introduced. So if naglibog mo unsa na ang unconditioned stimulus or unconditioned response. So the unconditioned stimulus is one that is unconditionally, naturally, and automatically triggers a response. So for example, kanang nagsimhot ka og food dayon maka-feel din kag hungry. So mo na siya ang unconditioned stimulus. Kanang dali ra jud ang response ba, automatic din ang response. If we say unconditioned response kay kanang unlearned response siya nga na occurs natural response to the conditioned stimulus. Example, the feeling of feel of kagutom, nakafeel ka kagutom. So in response of that, kaya nakasmell ka food. So more siya o nabali siya ang conditioned stimulus is when you smell food, kaya naka-trigger sa imuha nga gutomon ka. While sa unconditioned response kay if maka-feel ka og hungry kay kanang nag-response na siya sa imuhang na smell sa food. So that smell of food is the unconditioned response, and the unconditioned stimulus is that the feeling of hunger. So the second one is the during conditioning. So during the second phase of the classical conditioning process, the previously neutral stimulus is just repeatedly paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So as a result of this pairing, an association between the previously neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is formed. So at this point, the once neutral stimulus becomes known as the conditioned stimulus. So CS. The subject has now been conditioned to respond to this stimulus. So the conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral that after becoming associated with the unconditioned stimulus eventually comes to trigger a conditioned response. So for example, in our earlier example, suppose that when we smelled, if makabaho ta sa atong favorite na food, you also heard the sound of whistle. Anana. Well, the whistle is unrelated to the smell of food. Dili siya related, no? Dili siya related. So, if the sound of the whistle was paired multiple times with the smell, so if the sound of the whistle was paired multiple times with the smell, the whistle sound would eventually trigger the conditional response. In this case, the sound of whistle kanang taguhoy is the conditioned stimulus. So during this conditioning, it involves repeatedly pairing a neutral stimulus with unconditioned stimulus. So eventually, the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. So the last phase of classical conditioning is the after conditioning. So last na ni siya, as we say, after. So once the association has been made between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus presenting, the conditioned stimulus alone will come to evoke a response even without the unconditioned stimulus. So the resulting response is known as the conditioned response. So the conditioned response is the learned response to the previously neutral stimulus. In our example, the conditioned response will be feeling hungry when you heard the sound of the whistle. So after conditioning, sabi ang atong example is ang response sa feeling hungry kay ang yung response kay ang the sound of whistle. So in this conditioning phase, the conditioned stimulus alone triggers the conditioned response. So I hope you learned something from the three phases of classical conditioning. So thank you.
Now, let's move on to the key elements of classical conditioning. But first, let's talk about stimulus. What is a stimulus? A stimulus is anything that can trigger a physical or behavioral change. The plural of stimulus is stimuli. Stimuli can be external or internal. An example of external stimuli is your body responding to a medicine. And an example of internal stimuli is your vital signs changing due to a change in the body. And we have here a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that at first elicits no response. And an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that leads to an automatic response. In classical conditioning, when using together the unconditioned stimulus and a neutral stimulus, it will become a conditioned stimulus. The key elements of classical conditioning. First, we have the acquisition. The acquisition requires a neutral stimulus to become linked with an unconditioned stimulus. This must then be repeatedly reinforced to ensure strong learning takes place. I want you guys to look at the photo. As you can see, there's a food, a bell, and a dog. So the food gives the dog, ang response sa dog if makakita og food kay maglaway. And if ang tingog ra sa bell ang iyang mabatian kay wala ay response ang dog. But if you show the food while ringing the bell, the dog, ang response sa dog kay maglaway. And now, every time makabati ang dog og bell, magtuo na ang dog nga naay food. Suma na siya ang acquisition. Ma-acquire sa dog ang tingog sa bell, ma-acquire niya nga if naay tingog sa bell kay naay food. So that is the acquisition. Second is the extinction. The extinction is the opposite of acquisition. This occurs when a conditioned response weakens or ceases to exist. For a conditioned response to be maintained, the unconditioned stimulus must be reintroduced occasionally to top up the desired conditioned responses. So, di ba, nakakita mo atong dog, bell, and the food. Di ba, ang acquisition, kay munto siya, katumaanad ng iro nga na ay bell, na ay food. So, now, if ang dog, dili na siya permiti makabati og bell, like wala na bell, kadahatag di mo og food, mawa ang acquisition. Mawa ang hunahuna sa dog nga if na ay bell, na ay food. So, mana siya ang extinction. Third is the generalization of stimulus. Once a conditioned response has been created, it can tend to emerge as a response to other stimuli which appear similar. For instance, if a particular bell tone is the conditioned stimulus, similar sounding bell tones can elicit the same response. So the generalization of stimulus is when the dog heard a similar bell tone just like in the photo, the dog will respond to it like there's a food. Every time nga makabati sila og parehasod nga tingog ato nga bell, makaingon ang dog nga naay food. Ilahang i-generalize nga ang bisang usang tingog nga bell nga parihason ato, makaingon ang dog nga naay food. So muna siya ang generalization of stimulus. Another example is the stage fright. A child was laughed at when he gave a presentation in class, and he felt ashamed. Now, whenever he has to speak up in front of people, he feels nervous and fearful. A child was laughed at is the unconditioned stimulus. When he gave a presentation in class and he felt ashamed is the unconditioned response. Now, whenever he speaks up in front of people is the conditioned stimulus. He feels nervous and fearful. That is the conditioned response. Well, teachers can use classical conditioning to help children overcome some anxiety, provoking context. For instance, providing consistent reassurance and support may help a child who is anxious about reading aloud start to feel more calm and comfortable.